My name is John Cullen, and I want to tell you a story. It's a story about a scandal, broken relationships, gossip, rumors, money, corporate rivalry, and curling. It's the story of Broomgate, how a single broom, yes, a broom, turned friends into foes and almost killed the 500-year-old sport of curling.
It was a year I'd like to forget.
Broomgate, available now.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
How much Canadian content do you consume? Do you know what qualifies as Canadian content? Because I thought I did, and now I'm really not sure. Last week, the CRTC unveiled plans to tax the Canadian revenue of the big streaming services as part of its Bill C-11 measures to better support Canadian creators. Which, okay, sure, but which Canadian creators receive that support? What kind of creations will receive that funding? Is it perhaps a Canadian screenwriter who sells a great script to Disney? Is it a Canadian set designer who works on the latest blockbuster filmed in Hollywood North? Is it, maybe, hopefully, your favorite Canadian daily news podcast? Is it your friend's favorite independent artist? Is it any of those things? Is it all of them? Or is the clearest answer we have here just, it's whatever the CRTC says it is, and tough luck if that's not you? Oh, and will those big streaming services just pay that tax without putting up a fight? Or will they, perhaps, pass on that cost to their Canadian customers? How exactly does this all shake out? And what does it mean for what you're watching, what you're listening to, and what you're paying for? I'm Jordan Heath-Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Michael Geist is the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law at the University of Ottawa. He spoke with the CRTC about implementing Bill C-11 last December. Hi, Michael.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
You're most welcome. Maybe you can just start with the announcement last week that I gather was a pretty big step in putting Bill C-11 into action. Can you explain what happened?
For those that followed Bill C-11, which was this fairly controversial update to Canada's broadcasting legislation, largely because of concerns that it would capture user content as within its ambit, that legislation ultimately did pass. The government put forward a policy direction to the regulator, to the CRTC, saying they wanted the user content actually excluded. But that wasn't the end of the line for some of the controversy, because still at the heart of this legislation was, in the words of the government, to make the web giants pay.
Right.
They wanted the big streaming services to hand over money in support of Canadian content production. And this decision that took place last week says that streaming services of a certain size, they set a threshold at $25 million, have to contribute 5% of their Canadian revenues towards a series of different support mechanisms for Canadian content.
Do we have a sense, even just ballpark, how much 5% of that revenue amounts to?
We do, at least based on the CRTC's estimates. They say it's going to amount to about $200 million a year.
Okay.
That is admittedly a far cry from the kinds of claims the government was making when Bill C-11 was being debated. It talked about $1 billion a year, and there were certain groups that went to the CRTC and said, hey, we want our $1 billion. The CRTC's come back and said, well, no, that's not really realistic. Here's the number that we're coming up. We think that's going to be worth about $200 million a year.
Is that money enough to make a significant difference? And where is it slated to go exactly?
Listen, $200 million is certainly real money, but if you think about the costs of film and TV production and you start divvying it up in the way that the CRTC has with so many slices, it's hard to imagine that it makes a dramatic difference in the amount of production, especially when you consider that many of these companies already invest heavily in the Canadian market with a lot of film and TV production, for example, that takes place in Canada.
Right.
But the divisions are really all over the place. So they say, say, well, we want 2% of your revenues, so about 40% going to the Canada Media Fund. But even on that, they say we're going to divide that by 0.9% of this at a max going to English language, another 0.6% to French. There's the possibility that some of the existing investments might count so that the Canada Media Fund won't quite get that 2% at all. Another 1.5% goes to news, 0.5% to the Indigenous Screen Office, 0.5% to diversity inclusion funds. So it's being divided all over the place. And that's just film and TV production. You get similar kinds of breakdowns on the audio side as well.
Anything for podcasters?
Well, it's interesting that you raised the issue of podcasters because that's been controversial.
Right.
And there's, I guess, two elements here. First off, the CRTC says the revenues these companies generate from user content and from podcasts is not included in their Canadian revenue. So they've actually tried to exclude it altogether. And I have to say that by not addressing some of the broader issues, the longer term policy issues, they've largely, I think, excluded many of the digital media players. I mean, there are funds that they may be able to tap into, but a lot of this feels like either funding some of the legacy stuff, or in the case of funding news, it's funding stuff that has nothing to do, quite frankly, with a Netflix or Disney, some of the other streaming services that don't have news, and suddenly they're being asked to provide support for some of the large broadcasters and their news departments.
And you appeared before the CRTC to speak to them about how to implement this or what Bill C-11 might lead to. What were you there to warn them about?
When I appeared, I said, listen, you need to, as a commission, recognize that this isn't just about the cultural groups and the streamers and trying to divvy up this pot of gold. You've got to factor in the impact that it has from a competitive perspective in Canada. You've got to think about consumers. At the end of the day, the audience and consumers are really actually what funds all of this. And if you aren't factoring in the costs to consumers, who at the end of the day will often be asked to foot the bill, increased prices or less choice and the like, then you're doing it wrong. I have to say that message received some amount of pushback from the commission. And when you look at their final decision, I can't say I'm totally shocked to see that consumers don't figure in the decision at all. The word consumer doesn't even appear anywhere in this 44-page decision. It's as if the public simply takes what the commission decides, and if you've got to pay a bit more, so be it. The concerns around affordability, around more choice for consumers simply don't seem to factor into the commission's thinking at all.
How do these streaming giants currently support Canadian creators? I mean, it can feel occasionally like, there are some pretty large Canadian shows on these platforms, and to your point, you spend a ton of money here.
They do. In fact, in some ways, they are some of the biggest spenders right now on film and TV production in Canada. And a large chunk of that is referred to as foreign location service production. In other words, they're using Canadian personnel to help create these programs, but they aren't Canadian per se. At least they don't check enough of the right boxes to be certified Canadian content. That said, if your goal is to ensure greater economic activity, have lots of employment, they're making huge contributions on that front. They are also, though, and I think you're right to point to it, they are also producing and commissioning various programs that are Canadian in just about every way. But in some ways, they can't tick all the boxes because our rules basically say they can't. Our rules say that if at the end of the day, a Netflix or a Disney or an Amazon owns the production, they want to own it so that they can then display it and make it available on their global platforms, then it simply can't be Canadian content. That IP ownership has to reside in Canada in many respects.
So the Canadian content that makes the biggest global impact and global waves, and here I'm thinking of the shows that go like Schitt's Creek or whatever that go beyond our shores, those are the ones that can't be Canadian.
That's right. Well, Schitt's Creek's a little different, of course, because it starts as a CBC production and then gets licensed by these players and elevates it in a way that simply wasn't possible if you're only looking at the Canadian market. And in some ways, I think it's right to point to some of these shows because what these companies will say is that they're contributing in at least a couple of major ways. One is simply by dollars. So they spend a lot in Canada, and that needs to be factored in. For the moment, the CRTC isn't factoring bring any of that in. They say this is a base contribution that they're going to require. They will look at the rest of the contributions in a later process and, I suppose, figure out whether they think that's enough or not, and could even come back for yet more in terms of payment or more demands in terms of what those companies do. But beyond the dollars, they are such a critical part from a promotion perspective, from a discoverability perspective, for taking those Canadian productions and bringing it to a global audience. Mm-hmm. They argue that's a real contribution too, that if you want to have a successful sector, it's not just about the domestic market, it's got to be about a global market. And yet again, for the moment, the CRTC hasn't factored any of this. They've said there's an emergency here, or at least an urgency to get some money out the door, right. Even though if we take a look at the data from this past year, there has never been more spending on film and television production in Canada than there is right now. And that includes both the foreign location production and the certified Canadian content. Both are at record levels right now.
With the platforms that content appears on, and I mean, even the standard practices of IP changing so frequently these days, how do we adequately define Canadian content going forward when, I mean, you might write legislation last year and it doesn't include a platform that is the go-to platform within a couple years?
That, I think, is in many ways the elephant in the room here. And this new legislation, Bill C-11, was designed, or at least envisioned, a modernized definition of Canadian content. Now, I think we ought to recognize that's going to represent a serious battle, because you've got certain stakeholders, certain groups that have been beneficiaries of the existing system. They're a box that needs to be checked in order to become certified Canadian content. Well, then they're pretty happy with the existing definition and aren't going to be all that crazy about updating the definition to better account for many of the other stakeholders and contributors that go about creating this. But the CRTC recognizes it's got to do something. It has started behind the scenes the process of consulting with people, holding kind of different quiet events with various stakeholders to begin some of those discussions. And I think that we ought to be asking the question about if there isn't this urgency financially to move ahead right away with dollars, and they haven't figured out these kinds of big questions. Why are they essentially jumping the queue with a decision before they've figured out the really meaty issues? Because you first need to figure out, it seems to me, what counts as Canadian content, what counts as real contributions here, and then you can get into the question of, are these streaming services contributing enough or in an equivalent fashion relative to some of the other players? But they haven't done that. They've said, we want you to pay, and we'll figure out all these other issues later. And it should be noted that because they haven't updated these other issues, these companies will be asked to pay, but they won't benefit. And so they're in many ways unable to access the very kinds of funds that they're being asked to put into.
Their justification, the CRTC's justification for going so quickly, is it's urgent and, it's an emergency and Canadian creators need this money. Is it? How tough is the landscape out there right now for the places that will be getting this money? And, again, if it's such an emergency, like we mentioned earlier, $200 million is not, they're not going to save news media.
Well, I think there's a few things here. The $200 million is not going to save not just news media, but film and television production. And right. I think if we start breaking this down, we see just how flawed the approach is. The data tells us that there is record amounts of film and television production taking place right now in Canada. And that is both the foreign location production, the productions that take place in Canada but aren't necessarily certified Canadian content, and certified Canadian content. Both hit record amounts last year. So there's so much money in the system, or at least there has been over the last number of years, that sometimes the challenges are getting the sound stages and finding the people to do the work because there has been such a great level of success. On the news side, the prospect of forcing a Netflix or a Disney to pay large Canadian broadcasters to support their news outlets, I think raises a host of issues. There's obviously no real connection between the two. I mean, frankly, they're not in that news business.
Right.
But this is, of course, on top of the Bill C-18, the controversial bill involving Google and Meta for a time. Meta now blocking news in Canada, Google putting in $100 million. There's the tax credit credits the government keeps increasing to cover the costs of labor. So there's already a lot of money that's been contributed. And frankly, it's already created a scenario whereby there are real concerns about the independence of media given the dependence on government regulation. And here the CRTC goes, putting yet more money into it, and they are moving so quickly that they admit they don't even have a system whereby it can be allocated. They've asked one group, the Canadian Association of Broadcasters, to come up with a plan in a month so that they can find a way to take in this money and somehow send it out.
You mentioned C18. When the government took on Meta and Google, it may have bitten off a lot, in some cases more than it can chew. In this case, how have the streaming giants responded? Are they preparing to go toe-to-toe with the government on this, or is it maybe not quite enough money for them to really bother with?
I mean, I think the fair answer at the moment is we don't know for sure.
Okay.
But we can guess, based on some of the initial reactions, that certain services are clearly not happy, and there will be some reaction. On the audio streaming side, for example, profit margins are very narrow. They already pay most of the revenues they take in copyright royalties. And so if they are asked to take away an additional 5% of their Canadian revenues, well, something's gotta give, and that is likely increased costs for consumers. In other instances, you've got companies that, as we've been talking about, already spend a lot of money in Canada. They commission a lot of projects. And if they face a scenario whereby they don't even know if that's going to count, they may simply reallocate where some of the money goes and stop some of the productions that have been ongoing. And so I think it's unlikely that this really does generate $200 million in new money. I think in some instances, it simply means a reallocation of some of that existing spending and at a price, because it's pretty clear that there is the prospect of a trade challenge by the United States. I think there's a strong case that we may well be treating in a discriminatory fashion foreign streaming services when compared to their Canadian counterparts, which raises the possibility that on a dollar-for-dollar basis, whatever you generate could be offset by various tariffs that the U.S. could say, we're going to implement in order to try to dissuade you from engaging in this kind of discriminatory practice.
In the meantime, what does the Canadian media consumer actually get out of this bill, even in theory, I guess, because most Canadian consumers are watching, I would say, primarily American-made and foreign-made entertainment. And these streaming services have already gone through several price hikes over the past couple years.
Yeah, no, I love that question, because the consumer is so missing from this decision that the CRTC has not even bothered, it seems, to think about or ask the question. What exactly are Canadians getting as consumers for what is likely to be yet another cost increase to fund CRTC and government policy in this case? And I think the answer in many respects is not very much. I think if you look at how this gets divided in the many ways that it does, many consumers would say, you're increasing my bill for what exactly? You know, if the government wants to ensure that these companies pay their fair share, and I think everybody is in agreement that, of course, every company that operates in Canada needs to pay their fair share. Perhaps the best way to do that is to ensure that they're paying an appropriate level of taxes. And if the government wants programs, whether it's to fund news or to fund Indigenous or BIPOC creation, or they want to increase the envelope for the Canada Media Fund, well, then you've got some tax dollars to do it. But this feels like a pretty roundabout way where they charge the regulator, the CRTC, which it seems is less and less independent by the day, as it's almost just an implementer of government policy, to find this new hoard of cash allocated out. At the end of the day, it's consumers that pay, and I don't think many would conclude that they're getting good value for their money.
Is this the CRTC's job? Should it be beholden to the Canadian content consumer, making sure that they have Canadian stuff to see? Should it be beholden to Canadian creators who are losing forms of revenue by the day right now? Like, who ultimately should this body be serving?
Well, years ago, not that long ago, within the last decade, the CRTC adopted as its raison d'etre, as its mantra, putting Canadians at the center of their broadcasting system. The idea being that it was all about serving the public interest in Canadians. And I think as we take a look at this decision, those Canadians and those consumers are simply nowhere to be found. We're no longer, as individual consumers and as Canadians and the public interest, really a core factor in the CRTC's thinking at all. Its focus is on implementing what is a pretty clear government mandate driven, I think, largely by political considerations. And you've got this small group of stakeholders that factor into the decision. And in fact, if you read the decision, it's not only that consumers don't enter into it literally at all, but that the many Canadians that actually did take the time to either appear or provide submissions to the CRTC as part of the process, they don't get cited either. It's as if they don't exist, with this bit of consultation theater where you've got a commission that says, well, we'd love to hear what you have to say, but then don't bother grappling or engaging with what any individual Canadians have to say at all.
As this takes effect, what will you be watching to see?
Well, I think there's at least a couple of issues that we're going to look at. One is that there are these other elements that the CRTC has to deal with. They have provided a timeline that stretches into 2026. And so it goes even potentially past the next election. Part of what I'll be looking for, of course, is what the CRTC does, how the companies respond. But there's a political dimension here as well, because one could well imagine if we had, for example, a change in government a year from now, like the polls seem to suggest is a distinct possibility, with a government who's going to be focused on providing tangible evidence that they've got ways to try to save Canadians money. Well, the CRTC has basically handed them an easy way to do it. Because to the extent to which we see line items that say this increase is coming directly as a result of government and CRTC policy, removing it won't be all that difficult.
Michael, thanks again. Always a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Michael Geist, Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law at the University of Ottawa. That was the big story for a previous coverage of Bill C-11 all the way since its inception. You can type it into the search bar at the bottom of thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can send us feedback on this episode or any episode, and a reminder, we love suggestions for episodes we haven't done yet, but should do. The way to let us know is to email us, hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca, or call us and leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. The Big Story is in every single podcast player, and it's available on a smart speaker. You just got to ask for it by saying, hey, smart speaker, play the Big Story podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.